Some people believe a badge is the highest authority on the road, until they discover that real authority never needs to announce itself. The late afternoon sun stretched across the Alabama highway as traffic rolled steadily toward downtown Birmingham, painting long golden reflections across rows of passing vehicles. Marcus Reed guided his dark gray SUV through the right lane with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent an entire career remaining unnoticed. At 42 years old, he had learned that the safest way to complete difficult assignments was to attract as little attention as possible. His tailored navy suit rested neatly beneath a lightweight jacket. His federal credentials remained secured inside his breast pocket, and a sealed government case occupied the rear cargo area. Nothing about the vehicle suggested urgency. Nothing about the driver invited curiosity. That was exactly how Marcus preferred it. Earlier that afternoon, he had completed another routine responsibility connected to the United States Marshal Service. The assignment itself had been handled professionally, the paperwork signed without delay, and every required notification had already been transmitted through official channels. Now his destination was a federal office several miles away, where one final report would close another ordinary day in a profession built upon discipline rather than recognition. Marcus believed that doing the job correctly usually meant nobody remembered your name afterward. His attention remained fixed on the road ahead, while soft jazz drifted quietly from the radio. Families filled nearby minivans on their way home from school activities. Delivery trucks merged carefully between lanes. A city bus rolled through an intersection as pedestrians waited patiently for the crosswalk signal. It looked like any other weekday afternoon in America. Then flashing blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus glanced calmly toward the mirror before checking his speedometer. He had been driving exactly at the posted speed limit. His turn signals had been used properly. Every movement during the previous several miles had followed traffic regulations. Without hesitation, he activated his right turn signal and smoothly guided the SUV onto a wide shoulder beside a row of maple trees. The engine remained running while both hands rested comfortably on the steering wheel, where they could be seen clearly through the windshield. Years of professional experience had made this sequence almost automatic. Cooperation reduced confusion. Patience prevented unnecessary misunderstandings. Within moments, two marked city police cruisers stopped behind him. Officer Brandon Hayes stepped out first with a measured stride that reflected complete confidence in his authority. His partner, Officer Kyle Morgan, followed several steps behind while quietly surveying the surroundings. Hayes adjusted the body camera attached to his uniform, straightened his duty belt, and approached Marcus with an expression that seemed to form conclusions before asking questions. Marcus lowered his driver's side window as the warm Alabama breeze drifted into the vehicle. He offered a polite nod and waited silently for the officer to speak first. Around them, passing traffic continued without interruption, yet something almost impossible to explain settled over the roadside. It was the feeling that ordinary moments sometimes carry just before history quietly changes direction. Marcus had experienced that feeling before, and although his face revealed nothing beyond calm professionalism, he understood better than most that the next few minutes would not be remembered because of flashing lights. They would be remembered because of the choices each person decided to make. Marcus reached slowly toward the dashboard only after Officer Brandon Hayes requested his driver's license and vehicle registration. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture calm enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. He handed over the documents with a polite smile that neither challenged nor submitted, simply acknowledging another routine traffic stop. Hayes accepted the paperwork without returning the courtesy, his eyes shifting repeatedly between the identification card and the man sitting behind the wheel. For several quiet seconds, he said nothing at all. Marcus remained exactly as he was, both hands returning to the steering wheel while the steady flow of afternoon traffic continued only a few feet away. Officer Kyle Morgan stayed slightly behind his partner, carefully observing the exchange while occasionally glancing toward passing vehicles. Hayes finally broke the silence. He asked Marcus where he was coming from. Marcus answered truthfully that he had been finishing work nearby. Hayes immediately followed with another question, asking what kind of work required someone to travel through multiple counties during the middle of a weekday. Marcus answered with the same measured tone that had carried him through countless professional conversations. He explained that he worked for the federal government and was heading to complete administrative responsibilities before the end of the day. He intentionally kept his answer simple because unnecessary explanations often created unnecessary complications. Hayes studied Marcus for another long moment. Something about the calm response seemed to increase his suspicion instead of easing it. He asked whether Marcus was carrying any government equipment inside the vehicle. Marcus answered honestly that he was transporting official work materials secured in accordance with federal procedures. The answer only encouraged more questions. Hayes requested permission to inspect the cargo area. Marcus respectfully explained that the materials were associated with official government responsibilities and that he would gladly cooperate within the limits of applicable procedures. His voice never rose. His expression never changed. He simply stated the facts with quiet confidence. The roadside suddenly felt smaller than it had only minutes earlier. Several drivers slowed as they passed, curious about the growing police presence. Hayes took a slow step backward before speaking into the radio attached to his shoulder. His words were calm, but Marcus noticed the subtle change in tone that experienced law enforcement officers immediately recognize. Additional information was being requested. Additional attention was being directed toward what should have been an ordinary stop. Kyle Morgan watched Marcus closely, yet unlike his partner, his expression reflected uncertainty rather than conviction. He appeared to be evaluating the situation instead of assuming an outcome. Marcus appreciated that difference even though he said nothing. Years of experience had taught him that emotions rarely improved professional encounters. Patience almost always did. Hayes returned to the driver's window, holding Marcus's license once more. He asked if there was anything else about Marcus's employment that he should know before continuing. Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. He answered that every detail necessary for the stop would become clear through the proper channels if the information was verified correctly. It was neither a warning nor a challenge. It was simply the truth. Hayes frowned slightly, apparently interpreting confidence as resistance. Behind him, another marked patrol car slowly entered the shoulder with its emergency lights flashing. Marcus remained perfectly still as the afternoon breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic across the highway. And somewhere beneath the ordinary rhythm of passing cars, the first quiet signs of a much larger story had already begun to unfold. The arrival of the third patrol car changed the atmosphere more than the number of officers ever could. Drivers passing along the highway began slowing just enough to notice the cluster of flashing lights gathered on the shoulder, while a few pedestrians near a nearby gas station paused to watch from a distance. Marcus Reed remained seated exactly as he had been from the beginning, both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, and his attention focused on the officers rather than the growing audience. He had spent enough years working alongside every level of law enforcement to understand that situations were often influenced as much by perception as by facts. Officer Brandon Hayes walked several steps away from the SUV while continuing a conversation over his radio. His words were quiet enough that Marcus could not hear every detail, but he recognized the rhythm of someone asking dispatch to dig deeper. Officer Kyle Morgan stayed near the driver's side window, occasionally looking toward Marcus before glancing back at his partner. Unlike Hayes, Morgan seemed uncomfortable with how quickly an ordinary traffic stop had grown into something much larger. Marcus noticed the difference but offered no comment. Silence, when chosen carefully, could be more powerful than unnecessary explanations. After several minutes, Hayes returned carrying a small notepad. His expression had not softened. If anything, it reflected even greater determination. He asked Marcus once again to explain exactly what kind of federal work required transporting secured materials across county lines. Marcus answered with the same professionalism he had demonstrated from the very beginning. He explained that he was employed by the federal government, that his assignment required travel, and that certain details could not be discussed on the side of a public highway because they involved official responsibilities. His tone remained respectful. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply repeated what procedure allowed him to say. Hayes interpreted the careful response differently. He took another slow look inside the vehicle before asking whether Marcus possessed any additional identification beyond his driver's license. Marcus replied that he did, but that official credentials would be presented through the appropriate process if verification became necessary. The answer was factual, neither evasive nor confrontational. Yet Hayes seemed convinced that every measured sentence concealed something more. He stepped back once again and instructed dispatch to continue verifying the information already provided. Minutes passed. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the Alabama sky, casting long shadows over the shoulder of the highway. The soft sound of passing tires blended with distant traffic signals, creating an almost peaceful backdrop that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty surrounding the stop. Then something subtle happened. Kyle Morgan's portable radio emitted a brief burst of static before dispatch requested additional confirmation regarding the name on Marcus Reed's license. Morgan glanced toward Hayes with visible curiosity. Hayes immediately answered the call, repeating Marcus's full name carefully, letter by letter. Dispatch requested that the officers remain where they were while another agency reviewed the record. Hayes lowered the radio slowly, clearly expecting an ordinary response after a brief delay. Marcus recognized that phrase immediately. Another agency was reviewing the record. Those 5 words meant someone, somewhere, had encountered information that did not fit the assumptions being made beside the highway. Marcus remained perfectly composed. He neither smiled nor reacted outwardly. Experience had taught him that the truth rarely needed dramatic announcements. Sometimes it simply traveled through the right channels until it arrived exactly where it belonged. Several more minutes passed without anyone speaking above a normal conversational tone, yet every passing second seemed to make the roadside feel increasingly unfamiliar. Officer Brandon Hayes stood beside his patrol car, watching the radio clipped to his shoulder as though willing it to answer the questions forming inside his own mind. Officer Kyle Morgan quietly reviewed the information already entered into the mobile computer while occasionally looking toward Marcus Reed, whose patience had not changed from the moment the emergency lights first appeared behind his vehicle. Marcus remained seated with the same calm posture, occasionally glancing toward the slow stream of passing traffic before returning his attention to the officers. His composure did not come from confidence that everything would immediately work out. It came from years of understanding that professional procedures often moved more slowly than emotions. Suddenly, Hayes's radio crackled again. Dispatch requested that the officers verify Marcus Reed's full name one more time, including the middle initial printed on his driver's license. Hayes repeated every letter carefully before waiting for another response. A longer silence followed. Even Morgan appeared surprised that such a simple request required additional review. Finally, dispatch answered in a noticeably more deliberate tone. They explained that another federal database was returning information requiring confirmation from a separate agency and instructed the officers to remain at their current location until verification was complete. Hayes lowered the radio with a puzzled expression. He looked back toward Marcus and walked to the driver's window once more. This time his voice sounded less certain than before. He asked whether Marcus wished to update anything regarding his employment before the verification process continued. Marcus offered the same respectful answer he had consistently given throughout the encounter. He explained that all necessary information would become available through official channels once the appropriate agency completed its review. He added nothing more because nothing more was required. Hayes searched Marcus's face for several long seconds, apparently expecting nervousness or hesitation, but found neither. Instead, he found a man whose quiet confidence seemed rooted in experience rather than pride. Morgan watched the exchange carefully, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to question the assumptions made during the stop. A cool afternoon breeze moved across the highway as dark clouds slowly gathered on the distant horizon. The golden sunlight that had filled the roadway only minutes earlier softened into a quieter gray, giving the entire scene an almost cinematic stillness. Nearby drivers continued slowing as they passed, wondering why 3 city police cruisers remained gathered around one ordinary sport utility vehicle. Then another message came across the radio. Dispatch informed Hayes that the federal agency responsible for the record had acknowledged the inquiry and that direct confirmation was now being coordinated. Hayes frowned slightly. It was uncommon for routine traffic stops to require communication beyond ordinary databases, and the realization settled heavily across the roadside. Marcus recognized exactly what that update meant, yet his expression remained unchanged. He simply rested both hands on the steering wheel and waited. Somewhere beyond the city limits, Phones were beginning to ring inside offices where Marcus Reed was known by reputation rather than by assumption, and with every passing minute the quiet distance between local authority and federal responsibility was growing smaller. The quiet waiting finally reached the point where silence itself seemed louder than the traffic passing only a few yards away. Officer Brandon Hayes remained beside his patrol car with his attention fixed on the radio, while Officer Kyle Morgan continued watching both Marcus Reed and the mobile computer inside the cruiser. Neither officer spoke for several moments. The confidence that had shaped the beginning of the stop had slowly been replaced by uncertainty. Marcus noticed the change, but remained exactly where he had been since pulling onto the shoulder. His hands rested comfortably on the steering wheel, his posture remained relaxed, and his expression reflected neither frustration nor satisfaction. He understood that professionalism often meant allowing the process to reach its own conclusion. Then Hayes's radio came alive once again. Dispatch instructed him to stand by for a direct communication from a federal liaison handling the verification request. The wording immediately caught Morgan's attention. He turned toward Hayes with a questioning look, but neither officer interrupted the transmission. A few seconds later, another voice replaced the dispatcher. Calm, measured, and unmistakably professional, the federal representative requested that Marcus Reed's information be confirmed one final time before any further action was taken. Hayes carefully repeated Marcus's full name, date of birth, and driver's license information exactly as printed on the identification card. Another brief pause followed. Even the passing traffic seemed to fade into the background. Finally, the response came. The federal representative confirmed that the individual stopped on the roadside was an active Deputy United States Marshal traveling in connection with official government responsibilities. The representative further advised that the secured materials inside the vehicle were associated with authorized federal duties and instructed that no additional inspection should be attempted without proper coordination through established interagency procedures. Hayes remained completely still. Morgan slowly lowered the notebook he had been holding. Neither officer said a word. The information they had expected to uncover was nothing like the reality now being delivered through the radio. Marcus quietly watched their expressions change, not because he wished to embarrass anyone, but because experience had taught him that truth often arrived without raising its voice. Hayes walked back toward the driver's window, this time with noticeably different body language. The certainty that had guided each earlier question had disappeared, replaced by careful consideration. Before he could speak, the radio transmitted one additional instruction. The federal representative requested that the scene remain unchanged because supervisory personnel from the United States Marshal Service had already been notified and were coordinating directly with local command staff to ensure proper communication between agencies. Morgan looked toward the highway as though expecting something unusual to appear at any moment. Marcus simply nodded politely, acknowledging that the verification process had finally reached the people responsible for answering it. Far beyond the roadside, decisions were already being made inside offices where Marcus's name carried years of professional trust. And although no one standing beside the patrol cars fully understood it yet, the entire encounter had quietly crossed the line from an ordinary traffic stop into an event that would soon involve far more than a local police department. The first sign that everything had changed appeared long before anyone arrived. Officer Brandon Hayes received another transmission through his shoulder radio, but this time he did not answer immediately. He listened carefully, his expression growing more restrained with every passing second. Officer Kyle Morgan watched him silently, recognizing that the conversation unfolding over the radio was no longer routine. Marcus Reed remained seated inside his sport utility vehicle, his hands still resting comfortably on the steering wheel as they had from the very beginning. His patience had never depended upon knowing how quickly the truth would arrive. It depended upon trusting that professional institutions worked best when everyone allowed them to do their jobs. A few moments later, Hayes lowered the radio and looked toward the highway. In the distance, several dark government sport utility vehicles became visible as they traveled together with steady, controlled speed. There were no dramatic sirens. There was no unnecessary urgency. The vehicles simply approached with the quiet confidence of people responding to official responsibilities. They pulled safely onto the shoulder several yards behind the patrol cars before the doors opened. Men and women wearing professional business attire stepped out calmly, displaying federal credentials only after approaching the local officers. Leading the group was Supervisory United States Marshal Olivia Carter, whose composed expression reflected years of leadership rather than emotion. She greeted Officer Hayes respectfully before identifying herself and requesting a brief update regarding the traffic stop. Hayes summarized the sequence of events as accurately as he could, careful to describe only what had occurred rather than his assumptions. Carter listened without interruption. When he finished speaking, she thanked him for preserving the scene and walked toward Marcus's vehicle. Marcus stepped out only after receiving her acknowledgement, offering a courteous handshake and a quiet greeting that suggested two experienced professionals meeting during another ordinary workday. Carter confirmed aloud that Deputy United States Marshal Marcus Reed had been traveling under authorized federal assignment and that the secured government materials inside his vehicle were connected to official duties protected by established federal procedures. Her words were calm, precise, and free of accusation. There was no celebration. There was no attempt to embarrass anyone standing nearby. Instead, every sentence reinforced cooperation between agencies and respect for professional process. Hayes listened carefully, his earlier certainty replaced by thoughtful reflection. Morgan appeared relieved that the situation had finally become clear. Carter then informed the officers that their police chief had already been contacted directly and was on his way to the location so that both agencies could review the incident together with complete transparency. She also requested that all body camera recordings, dispatch communications, and related documentation be preserved according to normal policy, explaining that accurate records protected everyone involved. Marcus remained remarkably quiet throughout the conversation. He neither criticized nor corrected anyone. He simply answered the few factual questions directed toward him and thanked every officer for maintaining a professional atmosphere while the verification process unfolded. As the afternoon light softened beneath gathering clouds, the roadside no longer felt like the scene of a misunderstanding. It had become something more meaningful, a reminder that authority carried its greatest value only when guided by patience, humility, and the willingness to let truth speak louder than first impressions. Police Chief Daniel Brooks arrived less than 15 minutes later, parking his unmarked department vehicle a short distance from the gathering on the shoulder. He stepped out with a calm expression that reflected years of leadership shaped by experience rather than urgency. After greeting Supervisory United States Marshal Olivia Carter with a professional handshake, he quietly spoke with Officer Brandon Hayes and Officer Kyle Morgan before asking Marcus Reed if he would be willing to explain the sequence of events from his perspective. Marcus agreed immediately. His account was concise, factual, and remarkably free of emotion. He described the traffic stop from the moment he noticed the emergency lights in his mirror, explained that he had complied with every lawful request, and emphasized that he had intentionally limited discussion of his assignment because federal procedures required him to protect sensitive operational information until proper verification was completed. Brooks listened carefully without interrupting. When Marcus finished speaking, the chief compared that account with the statements already provided by Hayes and Morgan. To everyone's surprise, the essential facts aligned almost perfectly. There had been no argument, no refusal to cooperate, and no hostility. The difference had been interpretation rather than behavior. Brooks nodded slowly before turning toward Hayes. His voice remained respectful as he reminded every officer present that good policing depended not only upon vigilance, but also upon measured judgment. Professional caution was necessary, he explained, but assumptions should never become substitutes for verified facts. Hayes accepted the observation quietly. The confidence that had defined his first approach to the vehicle had given way to thoughtful reflection. Morgan remained silent as well, recognizing that the afternoon had become a lesson that would likely stay with every officer standing beside the highway. Supervisory Marshal Carter then requested that all available body camera recordings, dashboard camera footage, dispatch audio, and computer logs be preserved exactly as they existed. She explained that accurate documentation protected every professional involved, regardless of agency, and that transparency strengthened public confidence far more effectively than speculation ever could. Chief Brooks immediately agreed and instructed a lieutenant who had just arrived to begin securing every relevant record according to departmental policy. No one objected. The The conversation remained courteous from beginning to end, shaped by cooperation instead of confrontation. Marcus appreciated the professionalism being demonstrated. He thanked both agencies for allowing the verification process to unfold through the proper channels and expressed his hope that the incident would ultimately strengthen communication between local officers and federal personnel rather than create unnecessary division. His words surprised several people standing nearby because they contained no resentment. Instead, they reflected the perspective of someone who understood that lasting improvements rarely came from embarrassment. They came from honest evaluation and shared responsibility. As the meeting drew to a close, passing motorists continued along the highway, unaware that an ordinary traffic stop had quietly become an important lesson in professional accountability. The flashing emergency lights that had first attracted attention now seemed almost secondary to the conversations taking place beneath the soft afternoon sky. Before returning to their vehicles, Chief Brooks assured Marcus that the department would conduct a complete administrative review, not to assign blame before facts were examined, but to ensure that every decision made that day would be understood in its full context. Marcus thanked him with a simple nod, believing that true respect for the law was measured not by authority alone, but by the willingness to examine one's own actions with the same fairness expected of everyone else. Over the following weeks, the roadside encounter became the subject of a careful administrative review conducted jointly by the City Police Department and representatives from the United States Marshal Service. Every available body camera recording, dashboard camera file, dispatch transmission, and written report was examined in chronological order. Rather than searching for a single moment to assign fault, the review focused on understanding how ordinary assumptions had gradually influenced professional judgment. Chief Daniel Brooks insisted that every conclusion be supported by documented facts instead of personal opinions. Supervisory United States Marshal Olivia Carter shared the same expectation, emphasizing that cooperation between agencies depended upon trust built through transparency. Marcus Reed participated only when his statement or clarification was requested. He answered every question with the same calm professionalism that had defined his conduct on the side of the highway. He never exaggerated details, never questioned anyone's motives without evidence, and never attempted to turn the review into a personal victory. His goal remained exactly what it had been from the beginning: to ensure that future encounters would be guided by communication rather than assumption. Officer Kyle Morgan also provided a detailed statement describing each stage of the traffic stop. He acknowledged that Marcus had remained respectful throughout the encounter and that every instruction given by the officers had been met with patience and cooperation. His observations closely matched the video evidence, reinforcing the importance of evaluating behavior rather than relying upon first impressions. Officer Brandon Hayes approached the review with visible humility. Watching the recordings from beginning to end allowed him to observe the situation from a perspective he had not experienced while standing beside the highway. He noticed how Marcus had consistently kept his hands visible, answered questions politely, and avoided unnecessary confrontation even as the stop grew increasingly complicated. Hayes admitted that the information available during the encounter had been incomplete, but he also recognized that several assumptions had influenced decisions before the verification process had reached its conclusion. The acknowledgement was difficult, yet it marked the beginning of genuine professional growth. After reviewing the complete record, Chief Brooks announced several policy improvements for the department. Officers would receive additional training focused on communication during encounters involving federal personnel, verification procedures for government credentials, and methods of slowing the decision-making process when facts remained uncertain. The department also established clearer guidelines for coordinating with federal agencies whenever official responsibilities or protected government materials were involved. Supervisory Marshal Carter welcomed the changes and proposed regular joint training sessions so that local officers and federal personnel could better understand one another's responsibilities before future situations required cooperation under pressure. Marcus attended the first planning meeting only as an advisor, offering practical suggestions drawn from years of experience working beside local law enforcement across the country. He reminded everyone present that trust was never created by authority alone. It was earned one professional decision at a time. By the end of the meeting, The atmosphere no longer reflected the uncertainty of that afternoon beside the highway. Instead, it reflected a shared commitment to improving the system for every officer, every federal agent, and every citizen who might one day find themselves waiting beside a road, hoping that fairness would arrive before judgment. 6 months later, the same city looked remarkably ordinary. Yet for the people whose paths had crossed on that quiet stretch of highway, ordinary no longer meant the same thing. The department's new interagency training program had become a regular part of professional development, bringing local officers and federal personnel together inside the same classrooms, around the same conference tables, and into the same practical exercises. What had begun as one unexpected traffic stop had quietly become the foundation for stronger communication and greater mutual understanding. On a bright autumn morning, Marcus Reed returned to the city at the invitation of Chief Daniel Brooks and Supervisory United States Marshal Olivia Carter to participate in one of those training sessions. The atmosphere was completely different from their first meeting. There were no flashing emergency lights, no uncertainty, and no assumptions waiting to shape first impressions. Instead, officers from multiple departments filled the room with notebooks open and questions prepared, eager to learn from real experiences rather than hypothetical situations. Marcus stood before them with the same quiet confidence that had defined every moment of the previous encounter. He did not begin by speaking about authority or federal responsibility. Instead, he spoke about patience. He explained that every uniform represented a promise to the public, and every professional decision either strengthened or weakened that promise. He reminded the audience that calm communication often revealed more truth than hurried conclusions ever could. Officer Kyle Morgan listened from the front row, occasionally nodding as Marcus described the importance of allowing facts to develop before reaching judgments. Officer Brandon Hayes sat nearby as well. Months earlier, the experience had challenged his confidence. Now it had reshaped his perspective. During the discussion period, he stood and addressed the room with complete honesty. He explained that experience alone did not guarantee wisdom, and that genuine professionalism required the humility to recognize when assumptions had influenced judgment. The room remained silent as fellow officers listened carefully, understanding that meaningful growth rarely came from perfection. It came from the willingness to learn. Chief Brooks concluded the session by announcing that the department had already incorporated several policy improvements developed through cooperation with the United States Marshal Service, and early feedback from both local officers and federal agencies had been overwhelmingly positive. Supervisory Marshal Carter thanked the department for choosing partnership over defensiveness and reminded everyone that public trust depended upon institutions working together rather than protecting individual pride. When the meeting ended, Marcus stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The courthouse, city streets, and passing traffic looked much the same as they always had, yet he knew that unseen changes often mattered the most. As he walked toward his vehicle, Hayes approached quietly and extended his hand. Marcus accepted it without hesitation. Neither man needed a long conversation. Mutual respect had already said everything that words could not. Marcus drove away beneath a clear blue American sky, leaving behind more than a completed assignment. He left behind a reminder that true authority is measured not by the power to command, but by the wisdom to listen, the discipline to seek the truth before judgment, and the courage to treat every person with dignity long before their title, badge, or position is ever revealed. In the end, the most enduring form of justice was never the moment when identities became known. It was the moment when people chose to become better because the truth had quietly shown them the way.